Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Julie Brashatsky. I'm the Director of Community Living and Employment here at ICI, University of Minnesota. My preferred pronouns are she, her. I'm a white, middle-aged woman with short black hair wearing a Black University of Minnesota shirt. Like I said, thank you for joining us for this edition of the ICI Policy Forum. We try to do these every couple of months, 2-3 months on average. The topic today is based on the latest edition of the Policy Research Brief, like it usually is. The title and the topic is the use of physical restraints in schools. The discussants are today, which is very exciting, Anna Hertzling. Sorry, Anna, I always butcher your name. Please correct me when you introduce yourself. Who was last year's Minnesota Land Fellow. Also joined by Nancy Weiss, who is an advisor to the National Leadership Consortium on Developmental Disabilities. Jess Webster, an attorney and to the Legal Services Advocacy Project. And then as a bonus, and you didn't know this until now, but as a bonus, we're also joined by Erin Sandsmark, who's a community advocate, an educator, and a coalition programs manager for Solutions Not Suspension. We may also be joined later on by Kulia Pringle, also with Solutions Not Suspensions, and if she does, I'll ask her to introduce herself. Some housekeeping notes. Today's forum is being recorded. It will be posted on our website along with the slides. We will give a link to where it will all be posted at the end of the forum. As with all of our policy forums, this is an informal discussion, more or less, so feel free to chime in at any time, either via voice, mute yourself, or chat. We will have time for audience discussion at the end as well. I will just say to please remember to be respectful and respect each other's opinions and assume that we're all coming from the same good, well-wishing place. With that, let's get started. I'm gonna ask our discussants to just introduce themselves first, and I'll talk briefly about the issue and the data before we launch into a discussion. So Anna, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Anna Heinzerling. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Caucasian woman in my 30s with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail and wearing a black short sleeve shirt. I am a clinical social worker in the Twin Cities, and I, as Julie said, I was a Len Fellow in the 2023-2024 year. Yep.
Thank you. Nancy. Oh, you're muted, Nancy.
I am muted. Hi, my name is Nancy Weiss. I'm a white 70-year-old, just turned 70-year-old woman, brown hair, wearing a gray shirt and a necklace that says vote, having nothing to do with the topic here, but always worth a plug. You want us to say something about our background? I mean,
that would be great.
So I've worked in the disability field all my life, and pertinent to this issue, ran a positive behavior support program, community-based behavior supports for many years. And since 1992, have spearheaded advocacy against a facility in Massachusetts called the Judge Rotenberg Center that uses restraint as punishment, as well as food deprivation and electric shock. And so I've organized advocacy against the practices at that place for 30 plus years.
Thank you, Nancy. And thank you again for joining us.
Yeah.
And Jess.
Hi, friends. Jess Webster, staff attorney with Legal Aid. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a middle-aged white woman with long brown hair, brown-rimmed glasses, wearing a black shirt today. And I stand on the shoulders of many former and current legal aid attorneys that have been fighting against the use of restraint and seclusion for many, many years. But I've spent the last 3 years helping lead campaigns at the Minnesota legislature to end both prone restraint, the use of school resource officers using prone restraint on students, and the end to seclusion or solitary confinement for kids in schools.
Thank you, Jess. And then last but not least, Erin.
Yes, hello. I'm Erin Fansmark, she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman, 31, brown hair. And I am the Coalition Programs Manager for Solutions Not Suspensions. So what we do at Solutions Not Suspensions is we are a group of dedicated community activists and folks in the community that are dedicated to reducing harm in discipline and ending discipline disparities around race, disability, and all those things. And a lot of our work has been around physical restraints over the past year and around trying to fight against prone restraints and the use of them in schools, as well as seclusion and all those different things that are affecting our children every day. So that's me.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you all for your work. I'm going to say that in the beginning, and I'm going to say it at the end, and we'll probably say it multiple times throughout. So, all right. So thank you to the four of you for being here. As I said, the forum today is based on an issue of the policy research brief shown here, and the topic is the unrestrained use of physical restraints in school. Anna is the one who authored this brief. So I'm going to ask her to just very briefly to talk about what the issue is. So set it up for us. What is physical restraints? What the known dangers are? Tell us what we're talking about here and why we're talking about it.
Sure. So yeah, today there's obviously, as Erin was pointing out, a number of issues going on in the school that under the same kind of umbrella, like such as seclusion, but just for the scope of this, we're talking today about physical restraint, which is any, and this is the Department of Education definition, it's a personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move his or her torso, arms, legs, or head freely. So, with the biggest concerning one being like kind of prone restraint, where people are on their stomachs on the floor, but then also that's just, if you like grab someone's arm or hold them briefly, that's considered a physical restraint. It's using your body to move someone else's body or restrict someone else's body. So why we're talking about it today, so physical restraints, they've been used in a lot of settings over time, like hospitals, prisons, public law enforcement settings, and people have been concerned about them for a long time, which is why there have been laws and standards put in place for those hospitals, prisons, and public law enforcement settings. But where there still seems to be the most sticking point is in schools. And for whatever reason, there's been a lot of resistance to banning any kind of restraint in schools. There's currently no federal law that puts any restriction on physical restraints, and state by state, they're just a little kind of all over the place in terms of accountability and application.
Thank you. And then as far as like what we will be looking at during the rest of the slide, the data, you're the one that sort of pulled it together. So where do the data come from and what are we going to be looking at?
Sure. So a lot of our data comes from the Department of Education civil rights data collection. So that's something they've been collecting data for the last 50 years on different civil rights issues, like that can come from attendance at school, all the way down to use of restraints, and they separate that out by disability and race, English learners, ethnicity, and they've tracked one of the things that they've tracked is physical restraints. So the data we're looking at for that is going to distinguish between race and disability, and it's the data collected from 2017 and 2018 school year, simply because that's the year before anything was. The latest one they had that it was before COVID, and the numbers got kind of weird after that because of different schools being open at different times. So there is more recent data, and it proves similar things, but this is the one that we used. The other source is an article by Nuno et al, and that's that they looked at all the fatalities, restraint related fatalities over the last 22 years, I believe, and they also discuss what harms that non-fatal harms can happen from restraints.
All right, great. Now we're just going to look at a few key findings from this brief, and then so you're not all bored and we're not just talking at you, we're going to have a discussion around each of the key findings because they are meant as a conversation starter. So first one, there's lots of words on the slide, but I'm just going to ask Anna to summarize what is described here, and then we'll talk about it.
Sorry, I'm not seeing the slides right now. It's maybe that's just my own view.
Can everybody else see the slides?
Okay.
Yeah. Anna, do you want me to tell you what is on the slide? And you're muted.
Sure. Sorry, I thought I'd press on mute. Yes, I would like you to tell me what's on the slides, or I can just pull up what if it's the same as what we had before.
Sure. So there is a quote from the Nuno article that using physical restraints has many negative consequences. And then there is a list of the kind of consequences that are documented. And then the second piece on this slide is how many children there were that were subject to physical restraints nationally and in Minnesota, I believe, in 17-18.
Yep. Do you want me to summarize that more?
Yeah, if you're comfortable with the slides.
So this lists out, I think, people have maybe read through them at this point, but these are all the different negative consequences that can happen from restraints. I mean, first of all, they're not really correcting the original problem that led to them. Therefore, this could just happen over and over again, given that they create trauma for both the person being restrained, the person restraining them, and the people who may witness the restraint. They damage the relationship, obviously, with the person being restrained and the person restraining them. And I think just with the setting overall, they can lead to injury and death, particularly prone restraints. Those are the ones that have led to the most deaths. And I mean, the injury is not just for the person being restrained. The staff who are restraining often also get injured. Again, with oftentimes it's due to improper technique. But they're just generally dangerous overall, and they're easily misused, often punitively or in unwarranted circumstances, again, with improper technique. And just overall, I mean, the numbers that we have, they're the numbers that we have, and they might not actually reflect the real situation because there's just not a lot of accountability in the reporting. And so these might be a low estimate of what's actually happening because no one's really verifying the data that's being reported. So that said, the data we do have for the civil rights data, just raw numbers, in the 2017-2018 school year, 2,459 children in Minnesota and 71,315 nationally were subject to physical restraint at school. So these aren't just isolated incidents happening, they're happening quite often.
Here for that summary. Okay, so then I would like to pose a question to all of our discussants, and kind of an obvious one to me. If we know of all of these negative consequences, they're clearly well documented. There's a lot of evidence. If we know all of these negative consequences, why are physical restraints still being used in schools? Why? If we know they're so bad, why are they being used, and why are the numbers so high?
Well, I can jump in with the most cynical view, maybe. There is not the political will to do this differently. And community has shown up, legal aid has shown up, our partners have shown up to end these practices, and we have not been successful. And I think that everything on this slide underscores what we see at our Disability Law Center. We see children injured. We see children who don't want to go back to school. Trust in school has now been shattered. And it's a really, really poor tool that we keep in the toolbox. And just to underscore, a point on this data, I mean, we actually have a statewide working group on restrictive procedures, and our number, I mean, their numbers are, you know, more than 16,000 restrictive procedures in a year, and they're used on a lot of the same children in repeated use. And we know we'll talk more about the disparities on that with kids with disabilities and children of color. But right now, I would argue there is just not the political will. There was an incredibly thorough reporting done about this back in 2013 that led to some little regulations, some little changes. But really, our numbers are still staggeringly high on the use of this and the injuries and the bad outcomes on it. And so it's time to end it. We have not, as a state, decided or said that we're going to end it.
I'll jump in as well and say that, you know, the teachers, school is a very structured setting, and teachers have expectations, and the kids who sit quietly at their desk and do their work are the kids that don't get as much attention, and kids who, you know, behave in ways that are more vocal or active than that get attention. The Hartford Courant did a study of people who died in restraint, and in every instance, it started with a silly little power struggle. You know, she wanted to eat her snack, but it wasn't snack time, or he wanted to move his desk to sit next to his friend, but that wasn't allowed. And so teachers will draw this line in the sand and say, you know, I told you not to do that. And then they feel like they need to stick with that. And then these things escalate to the point that they perceive that there's some danger. When people, I mean, my experience is much more with adults in adult settings. When people act in ways that we say are behaviorally challenging, very often they're critiquing the quality of the life that we're offering them, or they're telling us what they need through their behavior. And rather than listen to people and try to figure out what they're telling us and what they need and give them a life that is more in keeping with what they need, we do exactly the opposite, and we strip people of choice and control, which just makes people angrier and more hurt and more likely to act in ways that are challenging.
Ask a follow-up question to that one. Is that why in schools? I mean, is it as big of an issue in other settings? Why particular schools? Are the numbers as high? Is it as much of an issue in earlier education, in other types of settings with other populations? Like populations meaning not just school-age children.
Sorry.
It's certainly an issue in adult services, not in every agency and not in every setting, but there are certainly organizations and facilities that have gone completely restraint-free. But you know, I can only guess that it's an issue in schools because kids are little and powerless and easily overpowered and scared.
And I was going to say, we have, in terms of kind of that political will piece and what the legislature has done and what our state agencies have done, we don't allow solitary confinement in childcare centers or some of these other practices in childcare centers. We no longer allow prone in prisons and other institutions. So it's an incredibly good question to ask. Why schools, where students have to be there, they have to attend, why would we allow these practices in schools for kids?
Are other people, are we doing participants or only panelists?
This is on autism. Do you want to chime in real quick? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, just as a parent of someone who had, you know, a lot of challenges and of course years in direct support, the truth is that a lot of parents, you know, they want their kids to behave at all costs. And so I think it's more complicated than, I just think people have a perspective of children as they need to behave, and we need to put power over until they do it. And so it's very challenging to get people to see that there are other ways. And I think people need richer examples of, no, this does work. It does work to collaboratively problem solve with a child, and you can actually get really good results with that, and everybody's a lot happier. But it takes skill and effort, and I think parents and teachers are frightened. They don't know what else to do. They don't have the skills, so they end up doing this.
I wanted to that point, thank you for sharing that perspective. I think a lot of what we combat in the legislature, it's a lack of political will, like Jess said, for sure. But there are also teachers that are not trained well in their institutions or in the degrees that they are getting. They're not trained well in how to handle classroom management in a way that doesn't lean into punitive behavior or punitive response or restraints. I feel like we have a really big gap in how we're training our educators, how we're training our staff. That's a huge gap. I feel like there's a lot of educators that I've met. In my previous role, I did a lot of teacher advocacy, and they felt like they had to unlearn some of what they were taught in their education in getting their degree. So that's something that we're combating every day. And I think the use of restraints in general, it's in schools, it's seen as another tool, right? We keep hearing from folks, it's a tool in the toolbox. We want to make sure we have everything in place to make sure that the broader school community can feel safe. Therefore, we need to be able to allow the traumatization of these individual students. To me, that's such this argument, I feel like it doesn't have a lot to stand on when we see the data and we see the outcomes for individuals and the harm it causes the teacher and the folks also putting the children in restraints as well. But there's a disconnect between the data and what we know to be right versus how we are educating our teachers and how we are getting folks into the classroom that know best practices. There's definitely a big gap there, and I'm not sure why, and maybe that's another avenue we need to look at as advocates, is looking at training and looking at the education our teachers are receiving before they are entering the classroom. But that's another aside.
Thank you. So that actually is a really good segue to my next question, and especially I think you all can all probably speak to it, but Nancy, this is especially for you, because you've had a lot of experience with this. So what are some of the alternatives that have been proven to work that we know can be applied instead of restraint?
So really, they're all proactive. They're all things that you would do before behavior occurs to lessen the likelihood that it will occur. And a lot of it, I mean, people talk about, like, why can't they use positive practices in an institution? You can't offer people good lives in bad places. So it has to do with figuring out what each person wants for their life, what they need. I mean, people will say to me, oh, he's just doing that for attention. And I think, well, isn't that sad that he would have to go to that extreme to get attention? Why isn't he getting attention all the times when he's not doing that? So, it's a way of rethinking the whole thing and making sure kids are getting attention when they're doing all the right things and ignoring behavior that's not dangerous. And, I think we do need to make the distinction between brief physical holding until the person can regain control and putting somebody in restraint, which often becomes, besides being traumatizing, it isn't just used to keep people safe. It's also used just as a punishment. So, once somebody's regained control, people are left in restraint. So, it has to do with really understanding how to meet people's needs and how to give people choice and control over their lives rather than asserting choice and control over them.
And Julie, can I just add that I think the question also came up in registration or in the chat about, for instance, the difference between solitary confinement or seclusion and a sensory room. One of the things that's been taken away from kids several years and longer is movement. We've shortened and taken away recess. We've taken away more opportunities for movement. And as Nancy talks about this, compliance model, kids need that movement. And so, some schools have sensory rooms, not a seclusion room. And a sensory room or a movement room can look a few different ways. A movement room might have balance boards, balance beams, trampolines, fidget toys, climbing structures, sensory tunnels, things where kids can move their bodies. A sensory room where, a child has had too much in the environment of the classroom, whether it be lights or noise or something else. A sensory room might be a place where you can go and have noise canceling headphones and quiet time, or maybe there's light and water, projection, different kinds of tools, also fidget toys, tactile mats, things that can give a kid a break from that classroom. And these things cost money, they take investment, and they also just take emotional investment, and they need to be taken seriously by the staff at the school and be set up.
I want to quickly, just before we move on to the next topic, there's a question in chat that we might want to just, because it's probably a quick one. Are there any differences anybody is aware of in terms of whether it's a special ed school or just general ed school, if there are any differences in how restraints tend to be applied in the different kinds of settings?
So restraint via seclusion cannot be used with general education students. It can be used in intermediate schools, and it can be used in schools for children that have disabilities. So restraint in a secluded or a solitary confinement experience. Restraints across the board for all schools can be used, but they're only supposed to be used in an emergency. And so that's one of the things we haven't talked about, is it's supposed to be only used in an emergency when a child might hurt themselves or hurt another person. And I think what we see across the board is it's not just used in emergencies.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to move us to the next key finding. And Anna, are your slides working? Do you need me to set up for you? Working? Okay. All right. So we have the next sort of big key finding, and I'm going to again ask Anna to just quickly describe what is shown on the slide, and then we'll talk about it.
Okay, I mean, basically what this slide is showing is the kind of proportion of students with disabilities, and that's defined by people who, under the IDEA Act, that are receiving like IEP services. The proportion of students who have IEPs or have a disability overall versus the proportion that are being restrained. And so, nationally, students with disabilities, 13% of national students, but 80% of students that are being restrained based on the data that we have. And in Minnesota, it's even more staggering. There's 17% are students with disabilities, and they are 93% of who are being restrained. So yeah, I mean, while restraints are an issue like across all settings, like general ed and special ed, I mean, it clearly is a problem that in the disability community particularly.
So it's pretty staggering to me. What do you think about it? Again, just a question to a discussion. What do you think when you see these findings, just in general? Are you surprised at all? Because I do think this is pretty staggering. So does this surprise you? Any just general reaction to this huge disproportion?
I think my first reaction is not surprised, even though the numbers are, I mean, looking national to Minnesota, I mean, it is staggering. It is pretty unconscionable. But the reality is, I think a lot of our more secluded settings, our setting 3s or setting 4s, are utilizing restraints even more than other, than in potentially like normal quote unquote like regular population schools, which has a huge smattering of different individuals. But I think it's I wonder if the concentration of this use of restraints being used in these more secluded settings is allowing for just an extreme disproportionate use of restraints. That's an idea or that's something that's coming to me. And I'm also curious, looking at this data, what would be the breakdown within the intersection of disability and race and race. I'd be interested to see, yes, our students with disabilities, but I'd be interested to see like the population of Black students with IEPs or Indigenous students with IEPs, boys, girls. I'd be curious to see how those breakdowns would happen and then how the use of restraints would be, I'm guessing, disproportionately used in those spaces as well. And seeing that data, I think, could be very interesting.
And I just come back to, we need to do things differently. And every time advocates have these conversations with schools, with school administrators, with special education experts in the schools, they always ask us about the point of crisis. What can we do when a child is throwing books? Or what can we do, in this moment of crisis or chaos? But they don't want to talk to us about what could we have done last month, last week, the beginning of the school year. Who are the trusted adults for that child when they have a crisis, when a crisis is brewing? What are the triggers for that child? Like, what are we doing ahead of time before we get to that? And they don't want to have that conversation. I shouldn't say everybody. Everybody doesn't want to have the conversation. I think there's a lot of thoughtful planning happening, but they are not willing to engage with advocates on upstream models of change. And that's really frustrating for us.
I think this also speaks to the degree to which people with disabilities are seen as something other. And so, in my advocacy work against this facility that uses electric shock to punish behaviors as innocuous as taking your eyes off your work or getting out of your seat, I have gotten very little headway with organizations like Amnesty International until I started talking about it as a program for troubled teens. Well, then people were interested. When I first talked to Amnesty International about what I saw when I went to this facility, they said, "Oh my goodness, what is this? Is this a juvenile facility?" No, I said, it's a school for kids with autism. Oh yeah, well, we don't get involved in that. And for 30 years, I've been trying to get Amnesty International to care about this issue, and really, finally, said to them, disability advocates think that you don't care about people with disabilities. Oh, well, I'm just saying that's what disability people think, because, as soon as you say it's people with disabilities, we have the ability to say, oh, well, we don't know what people like that need. So I think that's part of it is, our ability to think of kids with disabilities as something other than other kids.
Erin, if you don't mind, I'm going to read the quote that you put in chat because I think it's a good one. Sad, but good one. This also shows me that we do not know how to serve our children with disabilities. We're not serving them when we are failing. I think that's a pretty accurate statement. So this makes me sort of question just in general, because maybe some of us don't know as much about this, but what do you think about the relationship between the disability system and the school system in general? I also kind of want to see if we can context this in. So we know that there are all sorts of problems going on in schools just in general, right? Teacher shortages, lack of funding. So it's a compounded problem, perhaps, or is it not? Are they completely different systems? Some of this also have to do with the school culture or with the overall sort of school funding, where the school is located. I mean, how does that interplay come in between the school system and the disability system, and how do we view that all together? perhaps we're not, this is perhaps not, anybody from the audience want to chime in on that one? If not, we'll move on to the next one because there's much more material. All right, let's go to the next one because Erin, I think you might find this one particularly interesting. And Anna, I'm gonna ask you to once again set this up, explain what is on the slide, and then we'll talk about it.
Sure. So, looking at the similar kind of data here, we're at the proportion of students versus the proportion of students restrained. And this is within students with disabilities. It's like similar numbers for without. In fact, I think there's even a bigger discrepancy in Minnesota with Black students without disabilities. But so on a national level, Black students make up 18% of the student population, but 26% who are restrained. And in Minnesota, it's 11% of the student population, but 32% of who are restrained. And this is within students with disabilities. And if people are interested, they do break down this more in the civil rights data. I had a whole table of different breakdowns. This is just kind of, I think this is kind of illustrates the point the most. But yeah, there are similar disproportions within other communities as well. Yeah, and it also breaks down the numbers of students without disabilities as well.
Thank you. So I mean, given now everything that we know about all of the other disparities, perhaps it's not that surprising, but it's again, it's extremely stark. So what do you think are the underlying factors? What do we know are the underlying factors? What do we not know, but think are the underlying factors? And what do we not know at all? Anybody?
Just right off the bat, I think in Minnesota, seeing the difference between national and Minnesota, we see that it's worse here, right? Like the portion of students in Minnesota that are Black with a disability is less, yet our percentage is higher than the national average. And I think that coincides with the way Minnesota has, one of the worst disparities between Black and white students in the country. Minneapolis, especially, Minneapolis, St. Paul, it's really, to me, a continuation of that same through line that we have in this state completely segregated the ways in which we teach and educate our students and where our students are educated and how they are being treated. We have extremely segregated schools. We have extremely segregated populations in general, which allows for the complete mistreatment, I think, of our Black and Brown, Indigenous, and BIPOC communities. And so this to me just shares a really stark example of, in that smaller proportion of students with disabilities, in that intersection of race, this is the treatment that we're seeing. And I would assume, Black bodies tend to be criminalized at higher rates in general because young Black bodies tend to be considered adultified. They are considered more dangerous. They are considered to be somehow more of an adult than someone that's a white child right next to that Black child. And I think the adultification and the over-criminalization of Black youth is part of what's coming in here with our students with disabilities. That's my big overarching take. But I think it's a continued underserving and segregation of our systems in Minnesota that have allowed this to continue and be pervasive.
And adding on to Erin's point, we have our children are 40%. We have children of color. 40% is our student population, yet less than 6% in Minnesota are teachers of color. So you can be a child of color that never sees a Black teacher your entire career in school. And so when we don't have leaders that represent and look like our students and come from our communities, it also causes other problems.
Anna, anything you want to add? Or Aaron, please.
I was just to add on to the point of we do not have a population that is teaching our students of color that is representative of them. Just to go off of what Jess said, like we just don't have the percentage of teachers of color, of special education experts that are experts in diverse communities, in our BIPOC communities, in our local spaces, in our community spaces that are taking up these roles. And we just have, I think it's, what is it, 7% of teachers in the state of Minnesota are teachers of color. I think I'd have to look at that, but it's so low that this proportion is just not surprising because of just that fact alone.
And I think one of the perspectives that Erin brings is, she's coming from an organization and a community that has been advocating for a change and for protections for kids from restraint, especially dangerous restraints, prone restraint. And what we saw is that the voices of children and families that are showing up at the legislature to talk about their experiences being restrained are just not as valued as the voices of police or school resource officers, the voices of teachers. And it's like we don't even want to hear these children and these youth that are talking about it.
There was a question earlier in the chat from somebody about whether there are any student advocacy organizations where students can come and talk about their experiences. So perhaps we can, if anybody knows of any resources like that, we can put them in chat, or if anybody wants to talk about it. Does anybody from the audience wants to chime in on this particular issue? I mean, I also just want to make it obvious that we're all sort of white women here, discussants. All of us are white women talking about this. So is there anybody from the audience that wants to speak to this issue? Okay, before I go on, one quick question on the chat. Is there further disparities between central Minnesota, so Twin Cities, basically Twin Cities Metro, and greater Minnesota? Probably, I would guess so, but Aaron and Jess, you probably know more.
I would have to look at that data directly, and I'm not sure. I would assume that the lines are fairly similar. There may be some interesting data looking at socioeconomic basis as well. If there's less data around race, if we go into greater Minnesota, but that'd be very curious for me.
Yeah, you have to remember that the data source here is a national study, and so I don't know how detailed the breakdowns are in terms of parts of Minnesota or other kinds of things. We do have just the overall ones, and the overall ones are quite stark. This is the sad thing about this is nothing new. We had the same discrepancies in terms of how many students in special education were Black compared to how many students in the school were Black decades ago. This is just another example of how people who are in BIPOC communities have poorer outcomes, poorer educations, and are less valued.
And I'm not sure this is specific to the racial breakdown around this, but I was really disappointed in the response of the many police and sheriff departments around Minnesota when we basically pulling the resource officers just point blank from schools if they can't restrain students, and not having dialogue around it at all. It just, just pulling the resource saying we can't participate because we'll be in danger. And it was really just very disappointing and sad because we have to figure out how to do this and we need everybody involved, and just yanking that resource away is threatening and bullying, and it doesn't help.
When Legal Aid and Ed Allies and Solutions on Suspension and Multicultural Autism Action Network were advocating against prone, you know, one of the things we were told by kind of our Department of Public Safety was that if police were not allowed to use prone restraint on students, then they would use tasers. So it just told me this, you know, this very limited, narrow thinking about how to address kind of these points of conflict and crisis, where you don't think about what you could have done 10 minutes ago and a month ago, or even something different in that moment. You go to a more harmful, it might not be more, tasers might not be more harmful than prone. Prone is very dangerous, but to say that you'd have to hurt a child further because you can't hold them in this dangerous restraint, it just told me that we're not there. We have a lot of work to do.
Everyone. Okay, we are going to go on to talk about some of the policy recommendations that Anna has compiled as part of that brief, and then also talk a little bit about the Keeping All Students Safe Act, and then we will again turn it over to our discussants for their thoughts on what can be done policy-wise. So Anna. You.
And I just want to give some credit here to Sherry was discussing how like this is mostly we got the data from a national level, which we did, but there's also a data set that exists from starting with a task force that started in 2013 in Minnesota to try to reduce restraints, and that has data as well that's specific to Minnesota, specific within like students with disabilities, and so that might have some of what people are looking for, and also this is a lot of where the policy recommendations come from. So policy recommendations would be to develop and enforce more robust state laws restricting restraint, including banning prone restraint. And prone restraint is what came up the most in the last year and talked about with Minnesota law. So increasing reliable reporting and accountability for schools using restraint and seclusion. So ideally, we're not using these practices, and when they are used, having accountability and reporting so that we can kind of best understand the data and how to help nurture positive, safe school environments for all children. So that's kind of like what we were discussing before, you know, in terms of prevention. Like I think ideally no one wants to get to the point of students being in crisis and having to then figure out how to manage that. It's like by creating a more positive environment overall where children feel safe. Ideally, you're not dealing with this as much. Implement trauma and culturally informed training, de-escalation training, oversight, restorative practices, and positive behavior intervention support. So this is just, I know some of those items are controversial, and I think it just kind of speaks to the idea of the nurturing the safe school environment, like, and the idea of prevention and de-escalation before it gets to the point of where people are thinking we need to use restraints. And then with that, supporting federal legislation, because, you know, Minnesota, we've taken some steps toward trying to reduce restraints, even if they haven't been entirely effective. But at the federal level, again, there are some states that just have nothing written into their laws about restraint or seclusion. And there's the act, Keeping All Students Safe Act. It's been proposed since about 2009, and it keeps coming to the floor nationally and then not leaving committee. I think it's for like in an early year, it got a little bit farther. And yeah, it would ban dangerous restraint practices more nationally, so it's not up to the states. And yeah, every year it's kind of brought up and then dies in committee for, I think, a variety of mostly political reasons.
Thank you, Anna. Before I turn it to discussion to the rest of us, in terms of like what else would you add to the policies, what is important to consider when you start thinking about policy making around this. There's some lively conversation happening in chat, by the way, which is great. Keep it going, but please, just a reminder, be nice to each other. there's one comment that I want to just ask. Minnesota already has state laws prohibiting exclusionary discipline. Were you being focused on federal law? And is there any thoughts for this, especially Jess and Aaron from you? Are there any additional changes that are needed to Minnesota state law from your perspective? And we can sort of just have a broader discussion around this, but also like, for Minnesota state law. Actually, I was also going to ask, is this federal that we want a federal action?
Actually, we are in the midst of some real hot fights on this with state law right now. And so it'd be great if we could stay connected to the folks that are on the call that are really interested and invested in making changes at the state level. Lily says we already have state laws prohibiting exclusionary discipline. We have some. For instance, some of the advocates, Aaron and myself, have advocated a ban on suspending and expelling young kids, but that doesn't go all the way to grade 12. There still is a lot of exclusionary discipline happening outside of, some of the advances that we've made. But right now we are fighting to keep our ban on solitary confinement for K-3 children. That's something that we won 2 years ago. And now it's there was an effort last session. There'll be an effort this session to roll back that ban on solitary confinement for K-3 children. There are some legislators who want to be able to have an IEP include solitary confinement as a tool for children with disabilities, particularly where parent consent is given. And that's something that it's a no-go for advocates. So we'll be fighting that. And this issue of prone, we won a ban on prone for children by SROs. And then last year, as Susan noted, it got tossed. And so we advocates, I'm not sure this session is the session that we can have that conversation about banning prone, but that's something that we're going to keep on our radar, and maybe we have to go district by district to ban prone, but Aaron is also in the middle of that fight.
Yeah, it's been the issue around prone especially has been extremely difficult because of the uproar last year when the ban on prone was put into place. A lot of SROs and police around the state felt like they were not able to do their job without being able to put a child in a restraint that is a prone restraint or a highly restrictive restraint which often can cause harm and trauma to the child or the person instilling that kind of hold. So it's been a long fight. We were able to keep in place through, I think, a lot of great advocacy that Jess helped lead and other folks, that school administrators, teachers are still no longer able to use prone restraints, but SROs are now able to use prone restraints again. There was a big to-do at the legislature last spring. We had tons of testifiers. SNS held a press conference, but so did police, and there was a big fight at the Capitol about that. And now SROs are allowed to use prone restraints and are no longer considered parts of a school district. So now there's a more clear separation between police and schools. However, we still have police in schools. So we'll talk more about kind of the repercussions of what that's looking like now, but it's been a long haul, and it's hard to have conversations with people when you just are trying to speak for the humanity and the bodily autonomy of children, and we keep needing to use these types of tools. It's really hard to or consider this type of restraint a tool. We always try to bring it back to these are children. We're talking about children in schools, small bodies, and undeveloped, not non-adult brains, no matter who the child is. So we just see this over and over again, but it's been an uphill battle. That's what I'll say.
Do you know of any states that have done some sort of a good or better job of trying to wrap their heads around this issue?
I mean, actually, we've been getting calls asking, like, how did you ban seclusion or solitary confinement for K-3? Because there's other progressive states, blue states, that can't get it done. And we were really proud of it, and now we're kind of on the precipice of losing it. So I don't know. I don't know of any other states that are really doing a lot better on some of these things. I think Illinois has banned solitary confinement for kids after some really strong ProPublica pieces. But I don't know who is doing the best kind of across the board.
All right. Anybody else from our discussions in terms of states that we can try to learn something from?
I want to note, Justin's had some comments in the chat about Ed Allies and about teacher training, and I don't think that teacher training is an invalid point, and I think that all the advocates truly support more investment in teacher training, and we'd love to partner with Education Minnesota on looking for that investment. But if he has more to say, I'd love to hear it if he wants to chime in.
And I'm going to put a link. There's a website that has basically the full list of state by state policies about seclusion and restraint.
And then, Justin, if you do want to chime in, unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, for noticing that. I just would like to start by saying that Education Minnesota is against using harmful restraints against kids and wants to see this reform just as much as anyone else. And in fact, we were very involved with the legislation that people are somewhat mischaracterizing that led to the big kerfuffle over the summer with the SROs. And there's a lot of pieces of that very long legislative debate that have been left out of this conversation. It's more problematic than what the picture being painted here, but I don't want to get into the weeds of that. What I would like to talk about is the fact that I find it the thing that frustrates us as an organization and the thing that hurts the feelings of my members so tremendously is I would just like to point out that we're having this conversation at 2:00 on a Thursday when all 80,000 of my members are in their classroom. We don't have anyone on this panel that's actually working in schools right now that can speak to this very problem and the way the nuances play themselves out. But there are a lot of people on this call that are willing to say things like teachers don't know or teachers aren't trained. Teachers are caught in a system just like the students. And teachers have a lot coming down from them by the federal government, the state, but primarily by the districts they work for. And so those are the conversations we need to have to be able to issue real change. And we are one of the lone organizations at the legislature that consistently points out every year that Minnesota has the lowest threshold for licensing special education teachers in the nation. The lowest. It is not even a contest. Other states won't even recognize a special ed tier 1 license for Minnesota as something that is viable to put in front of a special ed student. And there are very organizations that we are citing as allies in this conversation are the organizations that brought us that reality. And so I just encourage the advocates to talk to teachers, invite teachers to panels like this, listen to teachers, and understand that teachers are under as much pressure as everyone else in this situation, and they are not the problem, but they are too often talked about as if they are the problem.
Justin, thank you. I will let our panelists respond to ours, but I will take it to say that as far as the timing and organization and the fact that it's 2 PM, totally valid point. Thank you for bringing it. That is on me as an organizer and totally valid. Thank you for saying that. And then the rest of it, I'll let our panelists respond to.
I mean, I don't think we're saying, necessarily different things. And we have been at the table with Caitlin from Education Minnesota. We've been on the same side of some of these fights. Education Minnesota weighed in really, really late on the SRO fight. I believe your letter opposing Prone came out after it passed off the House floor. So, advocates in terms of hurt feelings, we have some hurt feelings too. Maybe if Education Minnesota would have weighed in earlier, that would have made a difference in that fight. But I don't think we're at cross purposes with teachers. Erin herself is a teacher. She has been a teacher, and we work with teachers in our coalition. So that voice is not missing from our advocacy.
Absolutely. I do appreciate the points that were brought, and I think you get at what you said really hits at the nail on the head, where we do have teachers caught in the middle of a lot of different regulations and things that they're coming up against, that they have to somehow be experts in everything. What I want to see is long-term reform on how we are educating teachers, and how we are able to instill like best practices around for students with disabilities and for students of color. So I want more aids for teachers. I don't want less, and I want there to be more given for educators to attach the humanity of the students. And I know teachers are often, they're the last rung of all these laws and have to implement them directly. And I think, to your point, there needs to be more support, and we need to continue to advocate for that. That's my main point. And the data is still the data, and our children of color and our children with disabilities are still being underserved. So we need to do things to make that better. And that's really where I come from.
Thank you. Personally, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I don't think we can argue the fact that teachers are under-resourced. I mean, we know that in general, and that has to be kept in mind as well. I mean, okay. So we have some time left to just have an open conversation. People have been chiming in already, but this is kind of a time to talk for all of us to talk in terms of policy recommendations. If we were, well, pick your favorite politician. So if you were in a room with that favorite politician and they could actually make things happen, what would be your policy recommendation to them? What can we consider? What is actually practical? What is realistic? What have we not thought about? How do we do it? And anybody, feel free to unmute yourself, put in chat.
This is Susan again, and this is not really well formed or thought out, except that I just always come back to it. So just in my background, I am someone who did direct support for years. And when you talk about under-resourced, you talk about minimum wage workers that may not need even a high school degree to do the work. And I was brought up in the 80s where we were allowed to restrain a lot and we put people in rooms a lot. And what I found was all that had to happen to change that was we weren't allowed to do it anymore. And we didn't get more resources or really more anything else. I actually had better training when we were allowed to restrain on this stuff. But suddenly we couldn't do it anymore and people got a lot more creative. And so I want people to have support and help, and I want people to have resources, but to some extent, I just want us to really start thinking like, why are we doing this to people?
Others? And we can talk about problems, and we can talk about barriers. Or what are the solutions?
Maren, I hate to call you out in case you've had to step away, but Maren Christensen's on the call. She's the executive director of the Multicultural Autism Action Network, and I think she's done some organizing with parents and families and thought through some of the things. And she's worked on things like last year or the year before, getting rid of the ban on recess when used as a kind of a punitive tool, taking away children's recess. And so she's been working on some policies. I'm not sure, is she still on the call?
I am, Jess. Thank you for that. I think when I think about the policy recommendations, it kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier, that so much of our conversation is about what to do in the moment. And I think there's so much more of a conversation to have about those upstream solutions. And, we talk about de-escalation procedures, but we don't really talk about, shifting the focus from compliance to communication. We don't really talk about meeting kids' sensory needs. We really don't talk very much about like building in breaks. We don't talk about co-regulation, and all of those things are really important tools to avoid getting in situations where restrictive procedures are needed. And we, just started to have that conversation a little bit in the restrictive procedures work group, but I think that's really where we should be spending our time and effort. Right now, a lot of the training focuses on basically how not to get sued. How do you do a restrictive procedure legally? And so little of the conversation is about how do we avoid getting into this situation to begin with. So that's where I'd like to see our policy focus.
In the adult service world, in every state, there are requirements for people who work with adults in kind of group home settings or day programs to have some kind of training in one of these systems on how to de-escalate. And so, I agree. It starts way back when there starts to be she wants to do this, but she's supposed to be doing this, or, the beginning threads of those power struggles. And how, because it is hard. I mean, it's hard for parents and it is hard for teachers. Once you say, absolutely not, you need to do something else, it's hard to just let that go. And might put you in less of a position of control if you do let that go. And so it goes way back to when all these things start and how to, what's worth, it's not like you can let kids or adults do anything they want, because there are some things that are dangerous, but how to start way at the beginning so that you de-escalate situations that could rise to the level that restraint would be considered.
From the audience.
I want to go back to the comment that was made about this is Sherry Larson. The comment that was made about attending to communication and sensory needs. One of the biggest challenges that some kids and adults with disabilities have is they don't have effective ways to communicate their needs, and they don't know strategies to address their sensory needs. And one of the upstream, there's different ways to think about upstream. You can think of upstream as before behavior happens, but you can also think about preparing kids for adulthood by teaching them strategies to communicate effectively and teaching them strategies to identify when they need a break, when they need a sensory change, when it's time to put on the noise canceling headphones, giving kids instruction about that. And because we don't, it's not helping kids to use punishment or to use seclusion or restraint to manage behavior. It doesn't help prepare them for adulthood, and that's ultimately what we're trying to do in schools. We're trying to teach the kids what they need to do to be to manage their needs more as independently as they can. And so I look at all the adults who don't speak or have limited speech and don't have effective communication approaches. And I just wish that we could think about the needs of these kids in terms of, in order for those kids to be ready for the next grade, for the next year, for the next part of their life. We're not doing them any favors if we're not teaching them effective strategies to regulate their own behaviors.
Others? Okay, well, it's interesting that to me, as we're having this policy discussion, clearly the solutions are not simple, which is why, and not easy and not quick and not cheap, probably. And there's probably not like 100% agreement on how to best practically put them into place either, which is probably why we can't, why it's taken so long. Erin, please.
I was just to that point and thinking about all the recommendations or just gaps that we're seeing or pressure points that we're people are seeing in our schools and all these different issues. It really now I just lost my train of thought, but it just feels like all long-term advocacy change just does take a long time. It takes a lot of educating the public, educating districts, schools, legislators. Like none of this work happens quickly. None of this work happens in a vacuum either. I think the reality is the folks that are on the ground, our parents, our families, our teachers that want to see change, our first line of sharing out the stories of what's happening. And it's those stories, those touch points, that immediate access to seeing what's going on in schools and seeing restraints, seeing discrepancies, discipline, all these things. It's that the groundwork of years and years of advocacy that eventually translates to advocates like us being able to bring that to the legislature and provide policy positions and different laws that we could recommend to legislators. But it's a long haul. And I think there's not, like you said, there's not one path forward. But I think at the end of the day, what we can do as advocates, what we can do as community members is continue to listen to the people that are experiencing the issues firsthand and trying to be the best soundboards for those folks as possible. And I like to think of SNS as a springboard for those individuals that need to be heard the most. So I think at the end of the day, what we can do is just try to open our ears to the folks that are experiencing the most harm in the community. So that's not really connected to any one thing, but I think on the long haul, that's just the perspective, and hopefully long-term change happens when we listen and we collaborate the most with our tight community partners.
And in terms of that long-term work, my colleague Matt has been doing some research on corporal punishment in schools in Minnesota, and corporal punishment was banned in 1989, but if you look back at the legislative record, the comments that were made, the challenges that were needed to be overcome in those legislative debates and in testimony, they're all the same echoes of what we're doing now, of the fight now to end seclusion and to end physical restraints. It just hasn't changed much, but at some point we said paddling to kids is not okay. And hurting kids, spanking kids, hitting kids is not okay. And so, we have to get to a point where we say solitary confinement and dangerous physical restraint is just not okay. It's not a tool we use anymore. We used to use the paddle. We don't anymore. We don't use these tools anymore. And I'm not saying it's not a difficult fight. I'm not saying we don't need investment, but we do need the political will. And we do need an agreement just across all the adults in the room that this isn't right anymore. It's not the tool to use.
Maren, you have a hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that comment briefly, and thank you for making that point. When Erin was speaking about those most impacted, I think it's really important that we take a look at the data around, this is disproportionately affecting students with disabilities, it's disproportionately affecting students of color, and it's disproportionately affecting our kids under third grade. Like 70% of both the seclusions and restraints are happening to kids under 10. And that tells me we can come up with other solutions. We are for kids fourth grade and older. So it's not that we don't know what to do. It's just that we're not doing it.
That's a really interesting point because those are the kids that are more likely to be in inclusive environments, right? The younger the kid is, the more likely that they are going to be included in an inclusive school rather than in a separate environment. And so what is it about having kids in an inclusive environment that causes us to think about them in different ways? Just an observation.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I'd have to double check my data, but my recollection is that about 50% of the restricted procedures in Minnesota took place in federal setting 4 settings, which are most restrictive, the physically separate facility. So that means like the other 50% are happening in some of these inclusive settings. So I think that again, there's data to be dug into here. I mean, what is this telling us about, what kind of creative things are we coming up with for older children? What kind of problem solving are doing? And I guess the bottom line for me is that it appears that this is about power. We have power over our youngest kids, and so we feel free to use it. We're able to come up with some other creative solutions to work with older kids, and why can't we apply that same thing to our youngest learners?
Anybody else from the audience wants to chime in? We have a couple of minutes left before we close up.
Would it be worth having a follow-up session at a time that teachers are more available and invite teachers who either feel like they don't know what to do, or teachers who have come up with other solutions who can, serve as experts or coaches to other teachers? I mean, I'm sure there, if you look classroom by classroom, I'm sure there are teachers who never use restraint and who have all kinds of, my daughter is a second grade teacher. She's got all kinds of things she does when kids are getting upset or need some more support. I'm sure there are teachers who are fabulous at this, and maybe it would be good to, I'm not sure that this is the group to do that, but, and I'm not even in Minnesota, but it might be interesting to hear from teachers.
I think that's a great idea. We are here at University of Minnesota at ICI. We are happy to do whatever we're happy to host this, something like this at a time that is more convenient. Justin, looking at you now. But yeah, I think it's a great idea. We're happy to do what we can. Obviously, I don't know a lot of teachers in Minnesota, so I'd have to rely on the group here to get folks in and make them want to come and talk and speak to each other. But we're happy. I think it's a great idea. Justin, please.
We have a special education advisory board that's made up of both paraprofessionals and special educators from the entire state. It's regionally diverse. It's also diverse in terms of other demographic features. And we make sure to have someone from every licensure area involved in that group as well, that guides special education policy and advocacy for Education Minnesota. I have no doubt that they would be willing to send some representatives to speak. And we have many other people that we can pull together. And then we can also, of course, invite our membership to attend in the audience. And anytime we do anything on special education, we have tremendous turnout, as this is very top of mind for special education teachers, but even more so than our run-of-the-mill general education teachers. They're overworked, they don't have a lot of time, and so you have to meet them where they are at.
Yeah.
Thank you, Justin. If you don't mind, then we'll reach out to you later just to see if you'd still be willing to be that connector.
Yeah, I'll put my contact in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Also, there are a few comments in the chat about can we make sure that we outreach to our diverse communities, disability community, parents, or SROs. Yes, absolutely. I think that is. We had another an additional candidate for the panel who couldn't make it. And then there was some last minute snafus with the organization. I think if we sort of expand this and make this less research about our research, which is what we tend to do at these policy forums generally, but now per Justin's suggestion, per Nancy's suggestion, sort of shift this focus to learning from teachers, right? And having teachers speak to each other and to parents and to people with disabilities, then it will definitely be our outreach and the way that we make sure who takes part will be much more thoughtful.
Yeah, just a comment about pulling together whatever the next step is, which is that's what we're talking about right now. One of the things that we often do when we're talking about, well, what's the next step, is we look for naturally occurring opportunities where many of the people who we want to have participate are already getting together. Are there times and places where groups of teachers are already getting together that we could pull in the advocacy coalitions and groups and the families into those regularly occurring opportunities? It just increases the likelihood that the people we want most to be part of what's happening will be there. And yeah, as Julie said, ICI can certainly facilitate, but it might be that there are other naturally occurring events that would be hosted by another group that would also be effective.
All right, with that, I am going to put on the screen the links to where you will find our fabulous, very lively and interesting discussion. The recording will be posted on there in a couple of weeks, as well as the slides. So this will be posted in a couple of weeks. The slides will be posted as well. You can find the brief itself, the 2-page brief, on the brief link. We'll probably email everybody who was registered once this is posted, just so you do know when it's up and you can access the materials. There are a couple of links on the screen. Also, there's the white paper on the need to improve behavior support from Nancy Weiss. And then there's a link to Minnesota's Restrictive Procedures Working Group at the Minnesota Department of Education as well. And I think Erin, Jess, you can probably tell me more about, tell folks more about that if you wanted to in a minute.
Just that, so Marin actually is on this group. Legal Aid has served, I think, on and off on this group, and it prepares a report, Marin, correct me if I'm wrong, I think quarterly, with good data about restrictive procedures.
Yeah, that's correct. It gets the data quarterly. It puts the report out annually. So if you want to see the quarterly data, you have to actually request that from MDE.
All right. With that, I think I can say thank you to our discussants, all of you. If anybody in attendance wants to get a hold of any of us, write to me, please. You'll see my well, you won't see my email in the screen, but you should have it in the invite. So write to me, and I will share our discussants' email with you to just so that we're controlling this a little bit. So you can you can certainly get a hold of us, any of us. All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you for being here. Thank you for talking to us. Thank you especially to our panelists for this conversation. Have a good and lovely rest of your day and rest of your weeks.